wonderful, wonderful introduction. This is my first time in New Orleans. Yesterday I was outside sweating properly, seeing some plantations, seeing the bayou. That was really cool. But enough about all of that. And I forgot to bring my camera. If you want to talk to me about something that's not work-related, talk to me about photography at bowling tonight. I'm a big photographer. The message in my talk this morning is simple. Pick something you love and measure it. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing this. It doesn't matter what level of Carnegie maturity model you think you are on. This is a thing you can do, and I'm going to show you how. Metrics, measuring yourself, the word metric, for a lot of folks is like a four-letter word. It's an expletive. They're like lightsabers. They can be used for good and for evil. Come on, anybody, this is not a good movie, all right? It's like doubly evil. It's doubly evil here, right? You can write metrics that drive the right behaviors and the right outcomes with your organization, and you can drive metrics that are toxic to operations, are toxic to your personnel, that will make people want to leave. So the question is which things do you choose to measure, and how do you use that information? I'm going to give you some examples that I've accumulated over the years that I have found useful, mixed with some crazy ideas that I have. And if I talk fast enough, because I have 43 minutes and 21 seconds, we're going to have a little bit of fun at the end. Now, any conversation around metrics in a security context, particularly security operations, is going to include something around the mean or median time to detect, respond, and evict the adversary. That's not going to be my focus today, however, but if you want to talk about metrics, you've got to mention these things. When people first start talking about metrics, they usually say something, well, how long does it take me to close a ticket? Are we going to measure that? Yeah, we'll probably measure that. Do we want to drive our analysts to click faster on their SIM product? Click faster, close more tickets faster. Is that a good thing? Hell no. Not only no, hell no. But should we still measure it? Maybe. It's all about how you use it. So I'm going to give you some examples here. We can read about the first three, and these two wonderful publications. I have no relationship with these companies, but I enjoy reading these two guys every year. Lots of useful statistics. SANS collects a few as well. So I'm going to talk about the first one, and this one is near and dear to my heart. The metrics around how healthy are my data feeds from my sensors, from my logs, etc. When I'm green, is it really up? Am I really getting the data I expect? Just because the box that is being used to collect the data is online doesn't mean all is well. It's the watermelon effect. It's green on the outside and red on the inside. For those of you who have operated systems like these, SIEM systems, log collection systems, etc., you know probably what I'm talking about. We could have delays in receipt, we could have temporary drops, we could have long-term drops, we could have blips in the amount of data I'm getting, etc. So how do we measure this? Any SOC I've gone into who is not measuring this every day has lost data feeds. I almost guarantee you they've lost some data that they think they're collecting, but they're not. And that is actually one of the most risky things you can do, because it gives the illusion that you are monitoring systems, but you are in fact not. So how do you detect this? I will show you how to do it in 10 minutes or less. I'm going to use some pseudocode, and of course, since I work at Microsoft, I have to use pseudocode that bears a lot of resemblance to Azure Log Analytics. Sorry, Splunk. I'm going to run a query that looks like this. Show me the count of all of my events grouped by the collector name and the source environment, and bin that by the count per day, according to receipt time. And you get something like this in a CSV file or what have you. Pretty straightforward, right? This by itself doesn't really tell you a lot. Put it into a pivot table, and this is what you get. 10 minutes, you can do this. Doesn't matter if you've got any kind of reporting set up, etc. I can see here very clearly collector A has been down for 2 days. Everything from engineering went down for a whole day, probably longer than that, probably longer than 24 hours. Super easy. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've been doing this. And I will go into an organization that is not doing anything like this, and I will find outages. Do this over by hourly, do this over perhaps a month, and you will find outages in your data feeds, I guarantee it, if you have a collection feed of any particular size. Think of it like this way. Imagine a SAN, a storage area network area storage, et cetera. In that, you've got hundreds of hard drives. Any individual hard drive is probably very reliable, probably less than 1% likelihood of breaking this year. But if you have 500 of them, is there a dead hard drive at any given time? Absolutely. Same goes here. Let's talk about more advanced ways of doing this. I'm gonna actually automate this previous slide using the following queries. I'm gonna run 3 queries, and I'm gonna run 2 queries. I'm gonna join them together. First query: show me the count and distinct systems seen over the last 7 days on average. From 8 days ago to 1 day ago. That'll make sense in a second. Then do that same query, except for the most recent 24 hours of data, and then join them. And that very last thing, I set some thresholds. If my number of events seen in the last 24 hours is less than 25% of my base rate, or the number of devices seen is less than 50%, I am in alarm. Is broken. I can automate this, can't I? I can send myself an email every day. I don't need to do that pivot table anymore, because I get this. Easy. Easy. And then I can send this to my engineers, which I do. I have one person has to look at this email every week, every day. Is our stuff broken? Look at your email. Let's look at some other things we can measure here. Here's a fairly complex but very simplified architecture for gathering data from a lot of different sources. Maybe I have my syslog, my IoT data, my host telemetry, et cetera. Sometimes that goes through extract, transform, and load operation. Sometimes it doesn't. Hopefully I'm feeding into a message bus like Kafka, and then I'm sending it to many things. I should be writing a timestamp in every single bubble on this chart. Every single bubble I should be getting a timestamp. Every time I move that in and out of a message bus, every time I transform that data, every time I run a detection on it, write a timestamp. Why am I doing that? Because then I can measure the latency between each of these nodes. And that allows me to understand the overall performance of my system, and it helps me understand when things break. And things will break. Trust me. I can look at capacity. Are systems lagging because they can't keep up? Just looking at timestamps for when it's going through the system. Metric number 2. I'm going to talk about coverage, my data feed coverage. I have more than one dimension. When people first start talking about how are we measuring how we're covering our enterprise, they think of this first thing here. What's the absolute number or percentage of the hosts that it's in my enterprise? Should I chase to 100%? Should I chase this number to 100%? Who thinks yes? No one. Who thinks no? At least a few folks. Thank you, Chris. It's a moving target, folks. I would urge you never to chase your monitoring coverage to 100%, because the number of hosts online tomorrow is different than what it was today. And you don't know what you don't know. That's actually the biggest problem. You don't know what you don't know. And there's always someone else to serve. Number 2, I would measure the kill chain or attack cell coverage based on my analytics. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Number 3, I would measure what layer of the compute stack I am looking at. And number 4, I would think about what types of devices I'm covering. So my point to you is measure not just the breadth of your coverage, but the depth. Am I getting not just OS logs from a host? Am I getting application logs? Am I getting logs from the ILO or DRAC? This is a never-ending story, never-ending. How do I validate that all is well? Well, I showed you some of it earlier on point number 1. Point number 2, I would urge you to consider one of the following 2 strategies, potentially both of them. Number 1, inject synthetic events into your detection pipeline. Think of them like unit tests. Any developers here? Probably a few, right? Most of us know how to code. They're like unit tests. Shockingly, very few SOCs actually unit test their detections. I worked for one SOC for several years. This one very smart analyst wrote literally 300 detections for this SIEM. Not a single one of them was unit tested. Not a single one. Do you think they alerted much? Not at all. And then the second point is consider not just synthetically injecting bad events into your detection pipeline and marking them as such, by the way, but also having that same activity triggered out on the endpoint. And you're probably going to hear for at least one person in the next 2 days on a way to do that second technique. And then the third point, which is always humbling, is red teaming your SOC. Red teaming the enterprise that's being monitored, perhaps the SOC directly. This is always a humbling experience. In fact, all of these are. Every one of these techniques has been humbling for me and the folks I work with. Number 3, let's measure our analytics, our detections. There's some basic ways to measure them and then some more advanced. I'm going to talk about the basics first. Should we have the name, the description, what kill chain is it part of, what attack framework cell does it map to, what logs does it depend on? If I lose a log feed, what percentage of my detections are down? Which enclave or environment does it cover? And finally, who created it and when did they do it? Now, this is all pretty pedestrian, so I'm going to mention this stuff on the right here. And I'm going to show you how to use some of this in a second. First of all, what framework does it run in? For those of you who with more complex architectures, chances are you're not just detecting bad things using one thing. You're probably doing streaming analytics, you're probably doing batched query. Maybe you have a data science person on staff if you're lucky. Who modified it and when? When was it last reviewed and by whom? What is its status? Is it development, pre-production, production, or decommissioned? And then 12, where does it route to? Right, does an analyst look at it? Does it auto-remediate? Does it auto-ticket? Does it go directly to a customer, et cetera? What can I do with this? Well, I can measure my analyst productivity. I can look at my current analytics or my analytics last month and say, hey, you know, most of Alice's stuff is in production. Most of Bob's stuff's been turned off. Same goes for Charlie. Trudy's been not paying attention to at all, and Mallory, forget about the analyst entirely. Right? How are my analysts doing in terms of creating detections? Could this be gamed? Absolutely. Absolutely. How could I mitigate some of that? Here's some ideas. Map your detection fires to the analyst who originally created the detection in the first place through a series of joins. And don't just do it by the number of fires, but look at it, map it into what did tier 1 or whoever triaged the event, maybe you don't have tiers, map it into what happened with that analyst. In other words, who's writing the detections that are most fruitful? If you're keeping track of this, you can do this. Is this a little bit harder to game? Maybe. How are you supporting your customers? Again, same data used a very different way. What aspects of the kill chain are covered for everyone? I'll probably have a bunch of general detections that's used on everybody, but hopefully I'm also writing certain detections that are specific to certain applications, certain user groups, certain environments. How much love am I giving to each of them? And which part of the kill chain am I mapping to in those organizations? Stack them up. This is easy. I have to mention some of my former colleagues. Map your detections into the attack framework and then score your coverage. Not doing very good here, are we? Mostly red, right? I'm sure someone's going to mention this, right? Do I have the same coverage as APT1, APT28, APT34, et cetera? Number 4, let's talk about our analysts. Who are they? When did they join? How much time have they been in their role? How many alerts did they triage in the last 30 days? What's their true positive rate for escalations, particularly if in their tier 1, if you have a tier 1? Number 6, what's their response rate for when they escalate something to a customer? Just like in a call center, just like telemarketers, you know they're being scored on how often people hang up. Same deal. How many cases have they handled in the last 30 days that was escalated to them? And what's their mean time to close, right? We can game that one. That can be toxic. Should we measure it? Yes. Should we drive it? Maybe. It really depends on how you do it. Let's talk about some more advanced way we can score them. How many analytics or detections have they created that are currently in production? I've shown you that already. How many have they touched? That can be gamed, right? Click, 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 click. Look, I modified everything. How many lines of code have they contributed to the SOC repository in the last, 90 days? What's the success and fail rate of their queries executed either last 30 days, last 14 days, last 24 hours, what have you? Are they pounding the system? How many cycles did they take? Is that a good thing? Should you penalize an analyst for actually using the tool? Hell no. Should you maybe notice if somebody's not using it at all? Yes. If somebody just click, 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 close the alerts. Did they query them? No. Could we game those? Yes. How do we solve that? Look at the lexical or structural similarity in the queries that they're running. Measure it. Maybe your big data analytic platform has something to some natural language processing. Maybe it has fuzzy hashing. And even if it doesn't, I could perhaps count the number of different verbs in the queries that they're running and see how different they are from one query to the next. Who's writing cool queries? Who's hunting? This will tell you. And roll it all up. A good SOC should be measuring lots of things every day in front of their analyst, in front of their management. For instance, what detections are firing the most often? How much time do people spend on a given case, assuming that's accurate? This can be really thrown pretty far if you just leave a case open on the screen. I get that. Where are their inputs coming from? How many alerts, how many phone calls, how many postings on the website, how many emails, et cetera? What are the disposition of the alerts that are firing? Doing the tuning for detections for good SOCs is a daily activity. They're looking at that daily. So my point here is, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this. I promise you, you'll get something out of being more data-driven than you are today. And iterate this constantly. It's a lot of fun. Now, since I have tons of time, and I went way faster than I expected, sorry, Chris, I have one extra slide for you. So people ask, by the way, I looked this up, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, I get it. This is misattributed to a former Prime Minister of Great Britain, if I'm not mistaken. People ask, how many analysts do I need anyways? I almost wrote this equation. I wrote this, I was actually in Belize. I've never been to Belize. What movie is that from? I've never been to Belize. Ocean's 11. I've never been to Belize. I was in Belize, and I was sitting there, and I was thinking about something Forrester said like 10 years ago. They're like, oh, I think it was the number of analysts to number of sensors you have. I said, oh, that's garbage. People keep asking this question, how many analysts do I need? Here's the answer. I wrote an equation for it. It goes something like this. The number of analysts you need is multiply the following 4 factors. Number 1, the number of alerts you get every day that require human eyes on. That's N. C is the number of distinct compute environments you have, meaning imagine a set of systems with a common identity plane, common set of roles, common set of admins. And F is the number of minutes needed by the analyst on average to move through that full incident life cycle. F is a factor of many, many things. How good are your analysts? How efficient are they? Do they have the data they need? Can they run their queries fast enough? Are you getting pounded? Are they dealing with AV hits all day, or they're dealing with the A team? Can you know this before you've created your SOC? Can you know A? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? A few folks. Chris says no. I agree with you, Chris. You can't know this before you set up your SOC. Does this change over time? Absolutely. If I double the number of assets I'm monitoring, does that mean I need to double the analysts? No. And I've used that argument before. Oh, we have 50% more alerts. Well, we need 50% more analysts. And of course, the people we were proposing this to laughed at us. So I'm throwing this out there, and throw darts at me afterwards, maybe cyber tomatoes, maybe over a beer at bowling, and tell me what you think. Have a great summit.
Carson, Zimmerman. Fantastic.